Today we are going to be studying etymology. Etymology is a study of the origin and the history of words. If you discuss the etymology of a word, you're explaining how it entered our language. The history of the English language starts with the story of the invasions of the island of Britain over many hundreds of years. Originally, Britain was inhabited by groups of tribes that we now refer to as the Celts. Now these tribes fought amongst themselves quite a bit and were really not a country in the way that you would think of it. It was really just lots of different groups of people living in the same area and kind of doing things their own way. Because they were not very unified, they weren't really able to do much when Julius Caesar invaded Britain around 43 BC. So remember, 43 BC is about 43 years before the birth of Christ, so we're talking about a very long time ago. Julius Caesar came from Rome, and he eventually conquered all of the Celtic tribes and took over the island of Britain. The people he conquered then became Roman Celts, and Romans were speaking Greek and Latin. Things went on for a while, and then 400 years later, Germanic tribes began invading Roman territory, and Rome was forced to recall its soldiers from Britain in order to defend the city of Rome. This left their colony out there in Britain completely defenseless. And eventually, Germanic tribes invaded and conquered the Roman Celts. So let's take a little bit closer look at this map. The red area is Britain. So you'll notice it doesn't say Britain. It has a lot of other names on there because it's referring to the names of the tribes that used to live there. And then if you look over to the right in sort of the brown and green region, this is where Germany and France are today. But back then, there was an area called Saxony, Jutland, and the people who came from these areas were called the Franks, the Saxons, the Angles. So all of these different tribes. Again, they're not really unified countries per se, different tribes of people living in this area, and they started to invade Britain. The Romans had already been defeated and had abandoned the area, and so eventually these Germanic tribes conquered our Roman Celts. Each of these conquering tribes spoke their own unique Germanic dialect. But the longer they lived in Britain, the more their language merged with the conquered Roman Celts, and the more they all started to sound alike. Since the Angles and the Saxons were the largest groups of invaders, the common Germanic dialect that all of the tribes of Britain began to use became known as Anglo-Saxon. The English language developed from Anglo-Saxon. Let's back up for a second and just summarize. So basically, the invasions of the Romans and the Germanic tribes eventually created an Anglo-Saxon language, which was a blend of many influences, but mainly Germanic. Remember, first we had people who were Celtic, and they were speaking their own Celtic languages. Then we had the Romans. They spoke Greek and Latin. So in order to communicate with the people they conquered, there was definitely some merging of dialects. And then we have Germanic tribes, again speaking a whole bunch of other languages, and they move in and settle and stay. So you have a lot of merging of languages, and again, this is over hundreds of years. So eventually, Anglo-Saxon changed so much that the Germanic tribes on the continent could no longer understand them, and that is when Old English was born. So again, Anglo-Saxon is a language that basically was the foundation and what led up to English. English developed in 3 stages: Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. As you can see, these stages cover hundreds and hundreds of years, so it was a long process before English became what we know it as today. Old English was heavily influenced by Germanic dialects, because remember, it was those Germanic tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, who had basically conquered them. And when you're in charge and you're the conqueror, your language is probably going to have the most influence. In Old English, verbs came at the end of sentences. So think about that for a second. Instead of saying, I went to the store, I would say, I to the store went. Just a different structure. They also had something called the Thorn alphabet, and it looks nothing like the letters we use today. As you can see, it does not resemble our alphabet really much at all. Even if we go ahead and translate into a more modern alphabet, it looks very strange and unfamiliar. I certainly cannot begin to tell you what this says, but I know it's in Old English. Middle English developed because of the Norman invasion in 1066. So again, another invasion caused a big change in language. The Normans were a French-speaking people from Normandy in the north of France. Gradually, as the Norman landowners tried to communicate with their conquered peasants, French and Old English combined to form Middle English. For example, this is when the English language developed new words to distinguish the meat of an animal from the animal itself. So we had all these Anglo-Saxon peasants with words like cow and hen and lamb and deer and swine. Then we have the Norman French landowners, and they had words for the same animals, but they were beef and poultry and mutton, venison, pork. So we gained these new words, and you could say we basically had synonyms for the same thing. Like now, instead of just saying cow, I have this word beef. But there's also a different connotation here. All of these words in the right column are usually the words we use when we talk about eating the meat of that animal. Whereas on the left are when we're talking about the animal itself, which makes sense that those connotations would have carried through because the Anglo-Saxon peasants were the one taking care of the actual animal. They were so poor that they probably very rarely even ate the meat of the animal. Meanwhile, the landowners, the rich people, the conquerors, the French were the ones actually eating the meat. And so they called those animals by these names. And then as our language developed, you get different connotation between the two words. During the Middle English period, most of the new words that entered the language came from French. Under French influence, Middle English changed. It became much more melodious, very different from sort of the harsher consonant sounds of Old English. It also developed into a word order language, the subject, verb, complement structure we use today. So no more verbs at the ends of sentences. That changed. Here's an example of Middle English. I want you to take a look for a moment. I think you're going to recognize some of the words, and other words are going to look very strange to you. A lot of that has to do with simply spellings. Spellings have evolved and changed over time. Also, they pronounce things very differently in Middle English. Let's listen to some audio, and I think you're going to see what I'm talking about.
A knecht there was, and that a worthy man, that fro the time that he first began to read and out, he loved chivalry, troth and honour, freedom and courtesie. Full worthy was he in his lorde swerre, and thereto had he ridden no man fairer, as well in Christendom as in heathenesse, and ever honoured for his worthiness.
So, as you notice, things were pronounced really differently. Let's look at the same text here. On the left-hand side is the original, and on the right is a translation. So take a moment and kind of make some comparisons. You know, what words did you understand? Which ones did you not understand? Did it have more to do with the spelling or maybe even the pronunciation? All right, now we're going to talk about modern English, which is what we speak today. It dates from approximately 1500. One of the big things that caused it was something referred to as Grimm's shift, and that's a change in the way vowels were pronounced. That dramatically changed the sound of English by 1550, and that's something that you heard for yourself. In that audio recording, lots of words were pronounced very differently than we pronounce them now. For example, the word night, that K is silent when we say it, but if you may have noticed that on the audio she said knight. She pronounced it. So lots of changes like that. We're not exactly sure what caused Grimm's shift. We just know that it happened, and it really changed the way our language sounds. Then the second thing is the arrival of the Renaissance, which is a rebirth in the interest in classical languages and literature. I know you've learned about the Renaissance in your history classes. One of the things that became very popular and trendy to do during the Renaissance was to study Greek and Latin literature and to examine what the ancient Greeks and Romans were thinking and doing. So because of that, most of the new words that entered the language came from Latin and Greek. Because so many people were studying and reading those languages, it had a huge impact on modern English. So remember what we learned about which languages influenced each stage of English. Old English, most influenced by Germanic dialects. Middle English, most influenced by French. Modern English, most influenced by Latin and Greek. So how exactly do we get these new words in a language? We're going to learn the 7 most common ways that a new word enters a language. That means we will be studying the etymology of different words. Our first technique is borrowing. New words are formed from a word in another language. We simply borrow the word. If we don't have a word in English that says exactly what we want to say, we find one somewhere else. Challenge is a word that came from a French word, challenge. Notice that we changed the spelling a bit, the pronunciation a bit, but in the history of this particular word, the French word challenge means basically the same thing that our English word challenge means. Borrowing is the most common way new words are formed. Here are quite a few examples. Notice on the left-hand side, spaghetti, alien, moment, lame. The spelling for these words did not really change. On the right hand, I picked out some words where we did change the spelling. Tornado was from the Spanish word tronada. Look down, zombie and psycho, spelled differently, most likely pronounced differently as well. Oftentimes, the word that we borrow has a very similar definition to the word that we have now. But other times, the meaning has actually changed quite a bit through time. Let's look at some examples of that. Let's look at the word monster. If I go all the way as far back as I can, I have this Latin word monstrum that meant an evil sign or an omen. Then Old French borrowed that word monstrum and created monstre to mean a person or animal with a birth defect, because at that time they thought that birth defects were actually evil signs or omens. They thought, if they saw an animal in the woods that seemed to have something wrong with it or wasn't normal, that it was basically kind of like bad luck or an omen that something bad was going to happen. Then the English language borrowed that Old French word to mean monster, and our modern definition has evolved to mean much more just something that's unnatural and scary and frightening. Let's look at another one, the word hazard. If we go way back, there's this Arabic word azar, which means the dice, as in dice you would play a game with. Then Old French borrowed that word to form hazard, which means game of chance played with dice. Then English borrowed that Old French word, and our modern word for hazard kind of evokes the fact that playing a game of chance is risky, right? And maybe dangerous, especially if we're gambling with money. But now hazard means, kind of in more general terms, something that is dangerous. So as you can see, through time, the meanings of words kind of change and develop into different things. But it's interesting to see where they came from, because usually there's something in that history of the word that's still with us. So even though hazard doesn't have anything to do with the Arabic word dice, we still have a really similar connotation, and the idea of kind of something that's dangerous or risky still present in our modern definition. All right, second technique, onomatopoeia. This is when new words are created by imitating a sound or a movement. Saying splash imitates the sound that a splash makes. Here are some more examples. Words like gargle and splat, blip, buzz, crash. A word like crow might not be quite as obvious, but if you stop to think about the way a crow sounds, the bird cry sounds like crow, crow, and that's where the name for the bird came from the sound that it made. A word like murmur. When you say the word murmur, you're really making the sound of a murmur, which is when someone's speaking and you can't quite make out what they're saying. Third technique is proper nouns. This is when new words are formed by creating a common noun from the name of a person or a city or a company, something that's normally a proper noun. The word diesel came from the name of its inventor, Rudolf Diesel. So the name Rudolf Diesel is a proper noun. But we have this common noun, diesel, which refers to a type of fuel that is just a normal common noun, but it came from a proper noun. Here's some more. Frankfurter is actually named for the city of Frankfurt. Atlas. An atlas is a book that holds maps. And this word comes from the name of a mythical god, Atlas, who held up the heavens. So there is this connection between this mythical god holding up the sky and then creating a book full of maps. which gives you, direction. So this word atlas is a common noun, but it came from a proper noun. Cannibal. Cannibals are people who eat other people, and they were named for a man-eating tribe discovered by Columbus, the Cannibal. So when Columbus discovered this tribe of people, the Cannibal, who really did eat other people, this term cannibal was derived from that name. Googling. This is actually something that's happened in your own lifetime, the creation of this word Googling. It's named for the search engine Google. So Google is a proper noun, it's the name of a company, but this idea of searching online, this verb has become Googling, and people use that term whether they're using the Google search engine or not. They often just mean that they're searching online. Fourth example is compound words. New words are formed by putting two words together to form a new word. So doghouse, for example, is a combination of the word dog and house. Gunman, pretty obvious, gun and man put together. Football, placemat. So the thing about these words is that it's two entire words just smushed together. And usually the connection is very clear. A placemat, I know that it's a mat and it goes in the proper place, right, for my table setting. A football, is a ball that I'm kicking with my foot. The connection should be fairly easy to determine. Number 5 is word blends. This is when new words are formed by combining pieces of two words into one new word. So for example, brunch, breakfast and lunch. Part of the word breakfast and part of the word lunch have been pushed together to make brunch. Don't confuse this with compound words. Compound word would be the entire word. If this was a compound word, it would be breakfast, lunch. But it's not. It's a word blend because I'm just taking pieces, the front of one word, smushing it with the back of another word to make brunch. Motel is an example of that. It's motor and hotel. Traditionally, a hotel is a building you walk into. The rooms, the doors are on the inside. But motels are when the doors are on the outside, and they really only came into being after cars were invented. So it's the idea that it's a motor hotel, a hotel that you can just drive up to the door. You don't have to enter a big building. Smog is smoke plus fog. Grungy is grubby plus dingy. Snazzy is snappy plus jazzy. Our 6th technique is clipped words. This is when new words are formed by shortening longer words. For example, photograph becomes photo. Advertising becomes ad. Gymnasium becomes gym. Fanatic becomes fan. Hamburger becomes burger. Examination becomes exam. So you'll notice with most of these, you're pretty familiar with the original word and probably just think of these as synonyms. But as time goes on, 100 years from now, you might find that gymnasium isn't a word that people have even heard of anymore, that it just is a gym to everyone. So this is kind of a constantly evolving process that you're all witness to. Our 7th and final technique is acronym. This is when new words are formed by using the first letter of each word in a phrase. For example, swag. The term swag comes from the phrase stuff we all get. Now this term has kind of become more and more slang-like and kind of has some different connotations, but originally it referred to the free stuff that you would get if you went to a party, especially celebrities. When they go to a party, there's usually kind of like a gift bag with all kinds of merchandise because people want the celebrities to be seen using their products. So that term swag meant any free stuff you got from a party. Now it's kind of come to mean more of like a general attitude. Here's some more examples. Scuba is actually a word derived from a long phrase, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Laser comes from a much longer phrase. Zip code comes from a longer phrase as well. So notice each of those first letters of the word are being pronounced like letters. It's not an acronym if I say FBI, okay? FBI is a shortening of a longer phrase, but I'm saying the letters, FBI, okay? It would have to be FB, which I can't even pronounce for it to be a new word. It's really just an abbreviation if I'm saying the letters. We've got to be sounding them out and making a new word like scuba or laser for it to be considered an acronym. All right, that is the end. Please do not forget to fill in all of your notes. You can always rewind back through this video. Feel free to contact me with any questions. And don't forget to fill out your quiz on Kia.